Hello everyone and welcome back to our virtual Mishnah Berurah share. We're holding Mishnah Berurah Chelik Gimel and Mir Hashem. Today we will be learning Daf Chav Gimel Amud Aleph. We are continuing to learn Hilchos Shabbos. We have been working our way through Siman Reish and Gimel, learning the very complex halachas of Shehiyah and Chazara. Shehiyah, placing a pot on the fire on Erev Shabbos and maintaining it there on Shabbos so that the food should stay hot. And Chazara, the question of returning a pot that had been removed from the fire back to the fire on Shabbos. Our learning today should be Oschus 4. Achenu kol beis Yisrael, hanesunim b'atzaru b'ashivya, ha'oimdim bein bayom ubein bayabasha, ha'makom yirachem aleihem ve'yitziam yitzar l'rvacha me'afelu la'ora, u'mishiba l'geula, hashta b'agala u'bizman kariv v'naimar amen. Our learning should be Oschus refuah shalema for David ben Belima. So, we pick up today on Daf Chav Gimel Amud Aleph, top line in the Shulchan Aruch, in the middle of the words of the Ramah, V'yesh mekilin bazeh. What are we referring to? So, at the end of the previous share, we learned what really is a fascinating halacha. We saw, the Mishnah Berurah told us in his beautiful hakdama to this halacha, that there are Rishonim that hold that not only is there a question of when Chazara is mutter and when Chazara is aser on Shabbos itself, there is also an Isser Chazara on Erev Shabbos. Okay, what does that mean? So, what we saw is, let's say you put up your pot of chicken soup Erev Shabbos. We learned that you're supposed to do your hachanos for Shabbos early in the morning. So you got up, you davened v'sikin, you put up your chicken soup cooked for 3 hours, and now your chicken soup is done. It's still nice and early Friday morning. So you took your chicken soup off the fire. Now, before Shabbos, you want to do chazara. You want to return your chicken soup to the fire so that your chicken soup should be nice and hot for the Friday night Suda. Says these Rishonim, Tosfos, Dirshu, others, that there is actually an Isser Chazara on Erev Shabbos. Now, where do they get this from? They get it from a sugya in the Gemara in Shabbos. It's complicated beyond the scope of what we do, but they bring rayas to this from the Gemara, that there is an Isser of Chazara on Erev Shabbos. Now, the Rishonim are troubled. If there's an Isser Chazara on Erev Shabbos, exactly what is the geder of that Isser? It can't be that there's an Isser of Chazara on Erev Shabbos, meaning that once you took your chicken soup off the fire at 11 o'clock in the morning Erev Shabbos, you can't put it back on the fire before Shabbos. We know that that can't be, because we learned the halachas of Shehiyah, and we learned that Shehiyah is mutter under certain circumstances. Shehiyah is mutter. Now, what does Shehiyah mean? Shehiyah means putting the pot on the fire on Erev Shabbos before Shabbos and maintaining it there on Shabbos. So we know that Chazara is mutter on Erev Shabbos. The question is, if there's an Isser of Chazara on Erev Shabbos, precisely what is the Geder? So the Mishnah Berurah gave us from the Rishonim what the Geder is. And the Ramah says this. The Geder is like this. It depends how close to Shabbos you want to put the pot back on the fire. If you're taking the pot and you're putting it back on the fire so close to Shabbos that if that food would be cold, there wouldn't be enough time for the food to become reheated before Shabbos, that's when the Isser Chazara kicks in. So, for example, let's say you have a pot of chicken soup and you're a small family, let's say, you don't have a very big pot. Let's say you have this pot of chicken soup. Let's say if this pot of chicken soup was cold, it would take a half an hour to put it on the fire and get it nice and piping hot. So then the halacha would be, if you want to put the chicken soup back on the fire an hour before Shabbos, that's fine. You want to put it on 45 minutes before Shabbos, that's fine. But if you want to put it on the fire 20 minutes before Shabbos, so now, if theoretically the food would be cold, even if the food now happens to be hot, but if theoretically that food would be cold, you wouldn't have enough time to reheat it before Shabbos starts. You're not allowed to put it on the fire now. It's an Isser Chazara to put that chicken soup on the fire now on Erev Shabbos. Now, what's the reason for this Isser? According to these Rishonim, that this Isser exists, that they're machmir, And now we're talking about putting it, by the way, onto a kira that's not garafikatum. If the kira is garafikatum, then there's no Isser Chazara. It's only, the question is, if you're putting it on a kira that's not garafikatum. So, what would the Isser be? Why is there such an Isser? So the answer is, the reason there's an Isser over here is because if you're putting the pot on the fire so close to Shabbos, that looks and feels too similar to Chazara on Shabbos itself. Why is that? Well, let's think about it for a minute. Why do you do Chazara on Shabbos? The reason you do Chazara on Shabbos is because you took a pot off the fire. Now you want to put it back onto the fire to maintain the heat, to keep it nice and hot. Why are you doing this Chazara on Erev Shabbos? The reason you're doing the Chazara on Erev Shabbos is because you want your chicken soup to be nice and hot for the Friday night Suda. Now, if the food would be cold and you put it on the fire so close to Shabbos that there isn't enough time for it to get reheated before Shabbos starts, then when's the reheating happening? The reheating is happening on Shabbos. So the same way there are restrictions on Chazara on Shabbos, when you put food back on the fire on Shabbos to reheat it, there are also restrictions on Chazara on Erev Shabbos, when you're putting the pot on so close to Shabbos that theoretically the reheating would be taking place on Shabbos. And the same way Chazara is restricted on Shabbos. Why is Chazara restricted on Shabbos? Chazara is restricted on Shabbos either because of the concern of Shema Yechata B'Gechalim, you might stoke the coals to make the food hot, or because it's Mersi Kimavushal. It looks too much like Mevushal Lechatchila. It looks too much like initial placement of a pot on the fire on Shabbos, which is Aser. So too on Erev Shabbos. It's all one Gezeira, the Mishnah Berurah told us. We're gonna Aser Chazara on Erev Shabbos, so close to Shabbos, again because we're afraid that you might come to do Chazara on Shabbos, which would be a problem, Shema Yechata B'Gechalim or Merzi Kimavushal. So that's the Isser that we learned about in the previous year. On that, says the Ramah, top line, Chav Gimel Amud Aleph, the Yesh Mekilin Bozeh. While we see that there are Rishonim that are Machmir and they hold that this is Aser, Yesh Mekilin Bozeh, there are Rishonim that are Mekel. The Mishnah Berurah told us that this is the Shita of Rashi and those Rishonim who agree with Rashi. But the Ramah says, toiv lahachmir b'makom she'ein tzarich kol kach. If you have the ability to be machmir and it's not a big deal, you don't have a big tzarich, it's not pshat that you forgot to put the chicken soup on the fire until right before Shabbos, and now if you put it on, if you don't put it on, you're not going to have food for the Friday night Suda, so then you could be makel. But if it's not a big deal, if you're home and it's not a big deal to put it on earlier, so put it on earlier. Says the Mishnah Berurah, Eis Katan Ayin Daled. Toiv lahachmir, the Ramah says that it would be good to be machmir. Says the Mishnah Berurah, Lefizeh, according to this, bearing in mind that the Ramah says Toiv lahachmir, Ein litar hakdera mikira, you cannot take the chicken soup or whatever it is, the pot of food that you have on Erev Shabbos, you can't take it off the kira on Erev Shabbos, v'litnoi al gabe tanur she'enoi garafikotum, and then to go put it on top of an oven that's not garafikotum, samach lechashecha. You can't do this very close to Shabbos. Now, what is the Mishnah Berurah telling me here? So really, in order to understand this, we have to remember that back on Chav Beis Amud Aleph, near the beginning of Sif Beis over here, when we first started talking about Chazara. So, just a very quick reminder. The Mechaber, in the first opinion over here, discussing Chazara, the Mechaber told us that in order to do Chazara, you need basically 5 conditions. In order for Chazara to be mutter, the kira has to be garafikotum. It has to be either swept out of coals or the coals have to be banked. We need that the food has to still be hot. We need that you're still holding the pot in your hand. You didn't put it down. We need that you had das. You had in mind that you're going to do chazara. So we had all of these different conditions. And of course, it has to be mavushal kol tzarchai. The food has to be fully cooked. So we had all of these conditions when you're allowed to do chazara. But then the Mechaber told us 2 lines off the bottom on Chav Beis Amud Aleph that a tanur, and this is the type of tanur that they had in the times of the Mechaber, in the times of the Mishnah. Remember, a tanur was much hotter than a kira. And therefore the Mechaber told us that when it comes to Chazara, a tanur is much more chamor. By a tanur, you're not allowed to do Chazara, even if the tanur is Garuf V'Kotum, because Garuf V'Kotum doesn't help by a tanur. And again, we have to review this from the beginning of the Siman. Why does Garuf and Kotum help? Because if the whole problem is Shemi Yechata B'Gechalim, if what's driving our Isurim of Shehiyah and Chazara is that we're afraid somebody's going to come to stoke coals, well, if it's Garuf, if there are no coals because you swept them all out, or it's Kotum, so you went ahead and you banked the coals, you did something to be Memayet the Chaim, you did something to lessen the heat of the coals, then we have no concern Shemi Yechata B'Gechalim. And if the driving force behind the Isser of Chazara is Mechsi Kimavoshel, if we're afraid that doing Chazara looks too much like initial placement of a pot on the fire, so it looks like you're doing Bishul on Shabbos, well, if it's Garuf V'Kotum, it's not Mechsi Kimavoshel, because you don't do initial cooking on a kira that's Garuf V'Kotum. So that's why Garuf V'Kotum helps. But a tanur, said the Mechaber, Garuf and Kotum don't help by a tanur. Why? Because the heat of a tanur is so intense that, first of all, somebody might do initial cooking on a tanur, even if it's Garuf V'Kotum. So it could still be Mechsi Kimavoshel. Also, there is a concern of Shemi Yechata B'Gechalim by a tanur, even if it's Garuf V'Kotum. Because even if you swept out all the coals, you didn't get all of the burning embers, and you might stoke the few embers that are left, because stoking the few remaining embers in a tanur makes enough of a significant increase in the heat that it matters. So you might do it, even if it's Garuf V'Kotum. Kotum, you banked the few the embers, the coals, inside a tanur. That doesn't do it, because you might do that just to lower the heat a little bit and then stoke it to fire it up a little bit later. So Garuf and Kotum don't help by a tanur. So generally speaking, a tanur is much more chamor than a kira, and we always aser Chazara by a tanur, even if it's Garuf and Kotum. Against that backdrop, the Mishnah Berurah is coming over here to tell me, we just learned this halacha where the Ramah said it's good to be machmir and not do chazara on Erev Shabbos when it's very close to Shabbos. On that now, says the Mishnah Berurah, ulefi zeh ein litar laktera mikira v'litanai al gabe tanur she'ena garf v'kotum samach lechashecha. In our days, in the Chavetz Chaim's days, the Chavetz Chaim was saying, don't do chazara on Erev Shabbos, close to Shabbos, from a kira to a tanur. Why is the Chavetz Chaim saying this? Continues the Chavetz Chaim. Ta'af de tanur shalanu dinoi kikira. Chavetz Chaim says, if you'll remember, I told you that the halacha of a tanur nowadays, this is the Chavetz Chaim speaking, not me. The Chavetz Chaim says, I told you that the halacha of a tanur nowadays is the same as a kira. Our tanurim are not chamor like the tanur of the time of the Mechaber. So now you might think, oh, I don't have to treat my tanur so chamor. The Chavetz Chaim told me that my tanur is like a kira. But the Chavetz Chaim points out, in the context of the halacha that we just learned, habikira gufei yesh lahachmir l'deyazu. This opinion that the Ramah is expressing, this opinion of Tosfos and the Rishonim who agree with him, who say that there's an Issur Chazara on Erev Shabbos, what are they talking about? They're talking about a kira. So you're right, our tanurim are like a kira, but this Issur is like a kira, is applies to a kira. So don't think that on Erev Shabbos you could take the soup off the kira right before Shabbos and put it on the tanur. And then the Mishnah Berurah points out, "V'im garuf v'kotum mutar af b'Shabbos." Now, if you're talking about a tanur that's garuf v'kotum, then you could do chazara. You could do chazara even on Shabbos in the type of tanur that they had in the times of the Chavetz Chaim, because it has the din of a kira. And a kira, if it's garuf v'kotum, there is no isser of chazara. Now, one thing I just want to point out, I've told you here that according to these Rishonim that there's an Issur Chazara on Erev Shabbos. What is that Issur? The Issur is to put the pot onto a kira that's not garuf v'kotam. But if it is garuf v'kotam, I don't know why my internet connection just blinked there for a second, but it looks like we're good. Okay, yeah. The Isser would be to do Chazara on Erev Shabbos, right before Shabbos, on a kira that's not garuf v'kotam. Now, you might be thinking in your mind, wait a second, Rabbi Weiss. If you're talking about a kira that's not garuf v'kotam, shehiyah is aser on a kira that's not garuf v'kotam. So why would you be putting the pot on a kira that's not garuf v'kotam right before Shabbos? How about shehiyah? So there are a few different potential answers to that question. But the first one is, maybe you're doing that chazara right before Shabbos onto a kira that's not garuf v'kotam, because you want to catch the last few minutes before Shabbos of intense heat, and you're going to do garuf v'kotam right before Shabbos. Another potential answer is that you're talking about food that you're allowed to do shehiyah without garuf v'kotam. So, okay, more than that I'm not going to say right now. Okay, now let's go weiter in the Ramah. End of the top line here, Chav Gimel Amud Aleph, continuing in the context of this halacha that we've been discussing, says the Ramah, when we're talking about an Isser of Chazara on Erev Shabbos, V'dafka al gabe kira mamish, this Isser would only be Nageya onto the kira, on top of the kira, where you normally put the pots. Ava lismoich, but to put the pot on the ground next to the kira, afilu samach le'esh b'makom shayatzer ledisbay, even if you want to put it so close to the kira that the food could become hot to the extent of yatzer ledisbay, shari, that would be mutter. Afilu samach lechashecha, even immediately before Shabbos. Says the Mishnah Berurah is cut ayin hey. This iser is al gabi kira mamish. Hainu de bazeh yesh iser chazara sabach lechashecha v'chanal. When do some Rishonim say that there's an iser chazara on Erev Shabbos? That's only to do chazara onto the top of the kira. But to be masmichit, to put it next to the kira, is not aser. Is cut ayin vav. Even b'makom shayatze ledesbay. Even if it's a place that is Yad Seledes, where the food could become Yad Seledes. Di'i eina Yad Seledes boy, because if it's in a place where the food can't possibly become heated to the extent of Yad Seledes, I feel a b'Shabbos shari. Even on Shabbos you could put food over there. If you're putting the food in a place where it can't become Yad Seledes, then it's like the equivalent of putting the food on the kitchen counter. You're allowed to put food on your kitchen counter on Shabbos. There's no isser. There's no possibility of bishul over here. If there isn't heat that is to the degree of Yad Seledes, so this would be mutter as kat nayin zayin, even samach lechashecha, even right before Shabbos. Hainu afilun nitztanin legamri. And this would be true even if you're taking the food out of the fridge. It's completely nitztanin legamri. It's completely cold. Why? Because if you're not going to reheat the food to the extent of Yad Seledes, that's nothing. That's not bishul of any kind. V'im loy nitztanin legamri, and if the food is not nitztanin legamri, if it's still considered warm food, afilu b'Shabbos shari. This would be mutter even on Shabbos. U'kamoisha kasab is Siman shin yud chesif tesvav ba'agah, which we will see later on be'ezras Hashem Yisbarach. Okay, closing out the Ramah's discussion of this halacha, let's go to the third line down in the Shulchan Aruch, right by the Ois Kat Ayin Ches for the Mishnah Berurah. Says the Ramah, ubetanur, when we're dealing with a tanur, again, if we're dealing with the type of tanur that they had in the time of the Shulchan Aruch, in the time of the Mishnah, which had much more intense heat than a kira, ubetanur ein chilik bein lahachzir olav oilis meich etzloi. Like the Mishnah Berurah told us, like the Mechaber told us earlier in Sif Aleph, when it comes to a tanur, there's no difference between on top or putting food next to it. The extreme heat of a tanur doesn't allow you even to be masmich food next to the tanur. But that's only true if where you're putting the food, it's possible to reach the degree of Yad Seledes. But if it can't reach the degree of Yad Seledes, it would be mutter to put it there even on Shabbos. Siman Shin Yud Ches. Says the Mishnah Berurah is kat nayin ches, ubetanur ein chiluk, hainu betanur shel zman haTalmud. Here we're talking about the type of tanur that they had in the times of the Mishnah and the Gemara. Ukrar kosav zeh b'Shulchan Aruch b'Sif Aleph. The Mechaber already told this to me in Sif Aleph, that when it comes to the extreme heat of a tanur, you can't even be masmich the food next to the tanur. Elo desham ma'iri inyan shehiyah. But over there, the Mechaber was telling us in the context of the halacha of shehiyah, that you can't do shehiyah, you can't put food down next to the tanur to maintain it there on Shabbos, because because the heat of the tanur is too intense. V'kan ma'iri le'inyan chazara. Here the Ramah is telling it to us in the context of the halachas of chazara. Aval tanurim shalanu. But says the Chavetz Chaim, the type of tanurim that they had in his day, shepsuchim and atzad, that have a door on the side, heim kikira, those have the same halacha as the kiris that we have been discussing here in the Shulchan Aruch. Okay. So that closes out Sif Beis, and now we move on to Sif Gimel, which is a very interesting Sif. Now, in order to properly understand Sif Gimel, what we need to understand the circumstances that the Mechaber is addressing. The Mechaber over here is addressing a situation where you were allowed to do Shehiyah on Erev Shabbos on a kira that's not Garuf V'Kotum. So let's remember just a little bit of the basics of Sif Aleph when we spoke about Shehiyah. We said that under certain circumstances, Shehiyah is Asur. So if you have a kira that's fired up with gefes, that was the waste material of the olives, or it's fired up with wood, so these are fuel types that create coals. So now you have a kira that has coal in it, and you want to do Shehiyah. You want to leave a pot on top of this kira so it should be hot on Shabbos. So we had two opinions over here in the Mechaber. One opinion was that in order to do that Shehiyah, the food has to be cooked to the extent that not only is it mevushel kol tzarchai, not only is it fully cooked, it's also mitstamek veraloi. If it continues to cook and it dries out more, it's going to what's the word I'm looking for? It's going to diminish. It's not the right word. It's going to diminish the quality of the food. The food is going to get worse. If the food is mevushel kol tzarchai and it's mitstamek veraloi, there's no reason we should have a chashash shemi yechata b'gecholim. We're not afraid you're going to stoke the coals to increase the cooking and make your food worse. So therefore, according to the first opinion of the Mechaber, if you have food that's mevushel kol tzarchai and mitstamek veraloi, you're allowed to do Shehiyah on a kira, even if it's not Garuf V'Kotum. Even if there are coals inside the oven and you didn't bank them, you didn't sweep them out, you could do Shehiyah. Why? Because we're not afraid Shemi Yechata B'Gecholim. So there we have one case right away where you're allowed to do Shehiyah on Erev Shabbos. You're allowed to put a pot of food on top of the kira on Erev Shabbos and maintain it there on Shabbos, even though it's not Garuf V'Kotum, because there's no Kshash, Shemi Yechata B'Gecholim. Another case where you could do Shehiyah without Garuf V'Kotum, and that is, you have raw meat in the pot right before Shabbos. So you're maintaining a pot on the kira that's not Garuf V'Kotum, but right before Shabbos it has raw meat in it. Now we're not afraid Shemi Yechata B'Gecholim. We're not afraid you're going to come home from shul Friday night and stoke the coals. Why? Because you gave up on this food. You have no intent to eat this food tonight. You're going to eat it tomorrow. By tomorrow it's going to be cooked whether you're Mechata B'Gecholim or not. So since there's no Chashash Shemi Yechata B'Gecholim, you could do Shehiyah, even though it's not Garuf V'Kotum. According to the second opinion that we saw in Sif Aleph, it's even easier. According to the second opinion, if you have food that's cooked to the extent of Michael ben Drusai, it's cooked halfway through, or maybe even only a third of the way through, then right away you could do Shehiyah without Grifa Uktima. It doesn't have to be Garuf V'Kotum. Why? Because we say once the food is cooked to the extent that it's edible, we're not afraid that you're going to be Shemi Yechata B'Gecholim. So what we see is there are circumstances whereby you're allowed to do Shehiyah on Erev Shabbos without Grufa Uktuma. Once we understand that, we understand the following scenario. What if you put a pot of food on your kira that was not Garuf V'Kotum on Erev Shabbos? So your cholent is on the kira on Shabbos, and it's on a kira that's not Garuf V'Kotum, because it was a situation where you were allowed to do this Shehiyah. Now you woke up Shabbos morning, and before you go to shul, you check the cholent. You go to check the cholent, and now you find out that your cholent is burning. Uh-oh, what do I do now? What are you going to do? Of course, you could take the pot off the fire, but if you take the pot off the fire, you're going to have cold cholent. You're not going to have cholent for your Suda. Now, what are you going to do? You can't lessen the heat of the coals. If you try to do something to the coals, that would be mechabe. You can't do anything to diminish the heat of the coals, right? You can't do grufa. You can't sweep it out, right? That would be mechabe. It might even be havara, because when you sweep out the coals, you're also stoking the coals. You're going to expose coals to the air. You're going to flare them up. So it's havara, it's mechabe, it's muktzah, right? What else could you possibly do? You can't do ketima. You can't bank them with ash. That would be mechabe. So now you woke up Shabbos morning and your cholent is burning. What could you do? Now, chazara, could you take the pot off and put it somewhere else? Well, if you had another kira, let's say you lived in a fancy apartment and you had two kiras, and it happens to be that you had one kira that's not grufa uktuma, that's the one that your cholent is burning on, and you have another kira that is grufa uktuma, and somehow it's still hot, I don't know. So could you take it off this kira and put it on that kira? Yeah, if you fulfill all the conditions of chazara, right? If you pick it up and it's daitoi lahachzir and you don't put it down and the food is still hot, well, if it's burning, it's still hot. It's mavushal kol tzarchai. Well, yeah, it's mavushal kol tzarchai. So, and it's grufu ktuma, the other kira, you'd be allowed to put it on the other kira. But you don't have another kira. So now you have a bad situation. Your cholent is burning and you don't have an eitzah. You don't know what to do. It's either let the cholent burn or have a cold cholent. So for that problem comes along the Mechaber in Sif Gimel, and the Mechaber gives you an eitzah. And the Mechaber is going to tell you how to create a kira that is grufa uktuma, take the cholent off, and do chazara, put it back onto the kira that is now grufa uktuma. So you're going to take your kira that is not grufa uktuma, you're going to take the cholent off. When you take it off, you're going to have das lahachzira. You're going to have in mind to put it back. You're not going to put it down. And while it's off, you're going to make the kira grufa uktuma without being over on mechaba, without being over on avara, without muksa problems. You're going to make the kira grufa uktuma, and then you're going to do chazara. You're going to put the pot back. Let's take a look at Sif Gimel. Says the Mechaber. Hamashkim baboiker. Somebody wakes up in the morning, Shabbos morning. V'ra'a shehigdicha tafshila, and he sees that his cholent is burning. V'yarei pen yachdiach yoser, and he's afraid it's going to burn even further and it's going to become ruined. Says the Mechaber, Yachal l'hasir, you could take the pot off the kira, ulahaniach kedera yeshana reikonis, and now you could take an old, and we'll see why old, you could take an old empty pot and put it al pi akira, and put it over the opening of the kira. The kira has an opening in its top surface. That's where you put the pot down. So you know what you're going to do here? You're going to take, you might need two people for this. You might need your wife to help you with this. You're going to take the cholent off the kira. Now when you take it off, you're going to have daitoi lahachzira. You're going to have in mind to put it back. And you're not going to put it down. Or at least you're not going to let go of it. Now somebody's going to take an empty pot, invert it upside down, and put it on top of the opening of the kira, and then says the Mechaber, va'oz yosem akdera sha'atavshel b'saycha, and now take the pot of your cholent and put it al gabe akdera rikanis, and put it on top of the inverted pot that's over the opening of the kira. And when you do this, says the Mechaber, v'yizayer, you should be careful, shelo yosem kdera al gabe karka. Don't put the pot down on the ground. Your cholent, don't put it down on the ground, and according to the Ramah, don't even let go of it. And, of course, the pot has to still be hot. The cholent has to still be hot. And the Ramah says, remember, we already learned that as long as you were daiter la'azira, as long as you had in mind to put it back on the fire, we could be makel if you put it down on the ground. So, in a nutshell, what's the Mechaber telling you here? The Mechaber is telling you a very cute chap. Your problem is that you only have one kira. Your kira is not grufa uktuma. Since your kira is not grufa uktuma, you're not allowed to do chazara. So if you take the cholent off that it shouldn't burn, what do you do now? You're going to have cold cholent. Says the Mechaber, no. Take the cholent off have in mind to put it back, don't put it down. Take a pot, invert it upside down over the opening of the kira, and now presto, now you have a kira that's grufa uktuma. By virtue of putting this pot upside down over the opening of the kira becomes grufa uktuma. Now that it's grufa uktuma, so now you have a pot of cholent, it's mavushal kol tzarchai. When you took it off the fire, you had in mind to put it back. You didn't let it go out of your hands. It's still hot. So now you could do chazara, and you could put it back on your kira that is now grufa uktuma, because now chazara is mutter on Shabbos, and now you'll have nice hot cholent by the Suda. Now there's a lot to talk about here, and we're not even going to be able to talk about everything that needs to be spoken about. We do what we do. This is a Dirshu Mishnah Berurah here. So let's take a look at the Mishnah Berurah. Says the Mishnah Berurah is cut 9 test. The first thing that the Chavetz Chaim addresses is, why does the Mechaber say that you have to do this with an old pot? Why does it have to be an old pot? Says the Chavetz Chaim, aval chadasha, but if it would be a new earthenware pot. Over here we're talking about an earthenware pot. If it would be a new earthenware pot, this would be also usher. It would be usher to put it on top of the kira on Shabbos. Why? Because the final step in the production of an earthenware pot is to fire it up in a kiln. If you have a brand new earthenware pot, you can't put it on a kira on Shabbos, because that would be makeh b'patish. You would be finalizing the construction, the manufacture of this pot. The mislamin al yedei achayim v'nasis kli gemura al yedei zeh. Ubigderu shalanu, but by our pot, says the Chavetz Chaim, shekvar nigmar tikunan v'asiyasan betanu shel yotzrim. He says, in his day, when somebody bought an earthenware pot, it was already fired in a kiln. Efshir sheyesh lahakal b'm kamatchak. It could be that you could be makel, and you could do this even with a new pot. Ois cut and pay. The Mechaber said that you have to do this with an empty pot. Now, this is a little tricky. People wonder, why does it have to be empty? Well, first of all, I told you that we're inverting the pot. If you're inverting the pot, it has to be empty. Otherwise, you're going to spill it out, and you're going to spill the contents into the kira. There are those who learn that it doesn't mean that you invert the pot. You actually put the pot right side up, and you put it inside. Gets complicated. But the Mishnah Berurah tells us there's another very basic reason why the pot has to be empty. Says the Mishnah Berurah, if the pot that you're using is not empty, also lahasima lakira mechamasa gufa. How could you take a pot that has food in it and do initial placement of that food on a kira on Shabbos? So obviously the pot has to be empty. Ois cotton pei aleph al pi akira. You're taking an empty pot and you're putting it over the opening on the upper surface of the kira. What does that accomplish? Explains the Mishnah Berurah, Tahavale kira kigrufu ktuma. Now you're turning your kira that has coal in it, you're turning it into a kira that's grufu ktuma. How are you turning it into a kira that's grufu ktuma? Sharei hakderas leisemes es piakira. Because you're putting a pot over the opening of the kira. So you're putting something on the kira that's being mafsik, it's interposing between the pot and the coals. And now it's mutter to put the cholent pot back on. Now what you're doing is you're doing chazara on a kira that's grufu ktuma. You're allowed to do chazara on a kira that's grufu ktuma. Now this is harbe kolmosin nishmarin al zed. Many pens have been broken discussing this Mishnah Berurah. What the Mishnah Berurah is telling us is that the Mechaber is saying, by inverting a pot and putting it upside down on the opening of the kira, you're turning the kira into a kira that's grufa uktuma. How are you turning it into a kira that's grufa uktuma? Well, let's remember what the underpinnings of grufa and ketuma are. So the underpinning of grufa is, if you take out the coals, there's nothing to be mechate. If you take out the coals, how could there be a concern? You might stoke the coals. So there are those that want to say that by inverting a pot and putting it fully covering the opening of the kira, now there's no longer a concern of because you can't even see the gecholim. The gecholim are sealed inside the tanner. We're not afraid you're going to take this off and go be mechata begecholim. There are those that want to say that what you're doing is ketuma. Let's remember what the underpinnings of ketuma, the heter of ketuma. The heter of ketuma is when you bank the coals, you're doing something consciously to lessen the heat of the coals. Once you do something consciously to lessen the heat of the coals, we're not afraid you're going to do a 180 and you're going to go be mechata the gecholim. So over here, what are you doing? You're taking a pot consciously, inverting it over the opening of the kira, which lessens the heat that your cholent pot is going to get. That's why you're doing this. You're afraid your cholent is going to burn. So you're consciously doing something to be memayet the chayim of the gecholim. Now we're not afraid. You're going to be mechata b'gecholim. So you accomplished ketuma. So now chazara is mutter. There are those that want to say that all it is a heker. Once you put this pot on to interpose between the cholent pot and the fire underneath, you're making a heker. You're doing something to remind you not to be mechata b'gecholim. And that's also part of what ketuma is. The Chazon Ish seems to say that what you're doing over here is you're creating a situation where it's not derech bishul. This is not the way you cook. Let's remember, one of the key problems of chazara is that it's mechzi kimavushal. It looks like you're doing initial cooking on Shabbos. Nobody does initial cooking on top of the bottom of an inverted pot. So there's no mechzi kimavushal. The Chazon Ish also says that now it's not as if you're putting it on top of the kira. Now it's as if you're putting it on the ground next to the kira. Because you were memayet the choim. You took away so much of the heat that it's not as if it's on the kira anymore. Now it's like it's on the ground next to the kira. So these are all different explanations of why this creates a kira that's grufa uktuma. But the key to the mechaber is, now that you've created a kira that's grufa uktuma, you could put the cholent back on. Because now you're doing chazara onto a kira that's grufa uktuma. Now the Mishnah Berurah brings down a Magen Avram that creates even more issues. Olafizeh, according to this, says the Mishnah Berurah, Hu adin gam b'tanurim shalanu kisho'esh b'soicha. Back in the day of the Chavetz Chaim, the stoves that they used, imagine a wood-burning stove that people use to heat their house. There's a door in the front where you load in the firewood. You load in the firewood, you make your fire, you close the doors. The top is a metal surface. There are no openings to put pots. Says the Mishnah Berurah, according to what we just said, a wood-burning stove where the fire is inside and there's a steel roof on top, you should be allowed to do chazara on Shabbos and put a pot of food. If it was on a kira, let's say, you could take it off and put it onto the roof of this tanner. What's the mechaber saying? The mechaber is saying, you invert a pot over the opening of the kira, now you have an upside-down pot separating between the cholent pot and the fire. You could do chazara on top of that inverted pot. Says the Mishnah Berurah, quoting the Magen Avram, if so, you could take a pot and put it on top of the wood-burning stove, because the steel roof of the wood-burning stove is interposing between the cholent pot and the fire inside. Now, what's so difficult to understand about this is, in our case of the mechaber, you went ahead and you put the pot down on the opening of the kira. So you did something to be memayet the choim. You did something to make a heker. You did something to make it not mechzi kimavushal. In the case of the wood-burning stove, you didn't do anything. That's the way it is. So the Mishnah Berurah brings down a Maharil that disagrees with this, which the Magen Avram himself brings down this Maharil. Says the Chavetz Chaim weiter. Or they would have like a compartment on top of the tanur, which was a little place to put a pot on top of the tanur. But again, it's on top of the tanur, so the roof of the tanur is mafsik. That should also be mutter. However, says the Chavetz Chaim, but Maharil Issa, the Maharil says, "Tzarich lahafsik sham ala ma'aziva be'eze eitz oidaf lehekera v'yasam agdera leh." The Maharil says you can't be matir this. The Maharil says the only way you can be matir to put a top on top of the wood-burning stove is if you put a blech. You have to put a board. You have to put something on top as a heker to remind you not to be mechata b'gecholim. You have to do something to create a situation of grufa uktuma. You can't just rely on the fact that the roof of the tanner is mafsik between the cholent pot and the fire underneath. V'chein mashba b'seif Siman Berurah. V'ayim b'Magen Avram b'Seif Siman Reish Nun Tes b'Dinei Shiyah v'Atmana Shetek Gam Kenim Kamaril. The Magen Avram himself brings down this Maharil in Reish Nun Tes. Umash b'Sham, and it is implied over there that Yidei Heker Davar Amafsik Mutar Afilu Litin Lechatchila b'Shabbos. There are those that want to suggest that if you do put down this piece of wood on top of the tanner, you even could put something there to begin with on Shabbos. V'ayim b'Chedusha Rabbi Akiva Eger Sham disagrees. This whole discussion is only germane to when the cholent is still hot, it didn't cool off. The elavach, if the cholent is no longer hot, also mishum bishalim yuchal hischamim shia yatzeledis boy. If you saw your cholent burning and you were trying to figure out what to do, so you grabbed it off and you held it for an hour, and now it's stanein, it's not considered hot anymore. Now you can't put it even on top of a kira that's grufu uktuma, because if it's going to become yatzeledis boy, then since there's davar lach, since there's liquid in that pot, you would be over on bishul, and that you would not allowed to do. Ois cotton pay bays shaloi yasim. He says you have to. The mechaber said that you have to make sure that when you take the cholent pot off, you don't put it on the ground. Once you let it out of your hand, you can't do chazara anymore. The cholent still has to be hot. We see earlier in the Mishnah Berurah in Ois Cotton Nundalid, as long as it wasn't instana legamri, as long as it's considered still to be hot food, you would be allowed to do chazara. Sif dalid, 2 lines off the bottom in the Shulchan Aruch, end of the line. Whew! Okay, so Sif dalid says the mechaber, yesh limchais. We're all familiar with the issue of making sure that you have hot water available on Shabbos to add to your cholent if your cholent is drying out. People want to make sure that they have a chaynik, a kettle on the blech, or that they have an urn, so that if the cholent is drying out, they have water that they can add on Shabbos. Exactly how you do this, we'll discuss that. But that's the situation that the mechaber is going to address now from 30,000 feet. We're not going to go through exactly how you do that on Shabbos. But that situation in general, that's the topic of Sif Dalet. Says the mechaber, yesh limchais, we have to protest. B'yad hanayhagim lahatmin min ba'od yom kum shamayim chamin. Those who prepare. The word lahatmin over here is lav dafka. It doesn't mean to insulate. It doesn't mean hatmana. It means we have to protest to those who prepare a jug of hot water. And it means that they have a jug of hot water on the kira. So they have a kira, and the cholent is on the kira. They also have a little chaynik of hot water on the kira. Why? And they take the water from that chaynik and they pour it into the cholent if the cholent is drying out. Says the mechaber, we have to protest against the people who do that. And the Ramah says, but take a look in Siman Shin Yudches. Let's see the Mishnah Berurah. It says the Mishnah Berurah, Ice Cotton Pei Daled. Hanayhagin lahatmin. First of all, what do those words mean? Says the Mishnah Berurah, Ritzaynai Loimar. What the mechaber wants to say is, Shemechinin min be'oid yoim mayim chamin. They prepare on Erev Shabbos hot water, pen yitztarich la'aray saysan l'saycha tavshil, lest they need it because the cholent is drying out and they want to pour it into the cholent. Now the mechaber, the Mishnah Berurah, neither the mechaber nor the Mishnah Berurah say what I told you. I told you that the water is on the kira. Now, why am I telling you that? Well, where is this hot water? If it means that somebody prepared hot water before Shabbos and it's sitting on the kitchen table, then I don't need the mechaber to tell me that I'm not allowed to take that hot water from the kitchen table that wasn't on a kira on Shabbos and pour it into a tavshil that's on the kira on Shabbos. That would be taking something that's not on the fire on Shabbos and putting it on the fire lechatchila on Shabbos, which is also. So that's not what it means. I also don't think it means that the hot water was in hatmana on Shabbos, because we learned earlier that to take something from a kira and do chazara from a kira into hatmana is aser, because that would be considered hatmana lechatchila on Shabbos. That's not chazara. Going from a kira to hatmana is not chazara. That's not going from a kira to a kira. It's going from a kira to hatmana. You're not allowed to do hatmana lechatchila on Shabbos, even in a davar she'ena ma'asav hevel. So too, to go from hatumano to a kira, I don't believe is mutter. So it must be that this water was on the kira. Now, after it took me, I don't know how long to come to that conclusion and figure that out, it's very clear from the Nemukei Yosef, this is coming from a Nemukei Yosef in Baba Basra. If you look at the Nemukei Yosef in Baba Basra, the Nemukei Yosef in Baba Basra says that the water was on the kira. So that's what we're talking about here. We're talking about the prepared water, it's hot water, and it's on the kira. Now, what's the problem? If I have hot water on the kira, and the kira is gara fekatum, so chazara is mutter. If I have hot water on the kira, and I have the cholent on the kira, why can't I take the water from the hot water pot and pour it into the cholent pot? What's the problem? Explains the Mishnah Berurah. V'dasa Shulchan Aruch, it's the opinion of the Shulchan Aruch limchais bazer that we have to protest against people who do this. Why? Because says the Mechaber, it's very nice. The cholent is on the kira, the hot water is on the kira. But how do you know that both pots are hot? Maybe the cholent pot is hot and the hot water is not hot. Maybe this one is yatzaledis and that was not yatzaledis. And the Mechaber, Mishnah Berurah says that Mechaber is saying sometimes that happens. And if that's true, then you're going to take the water that's not yatzaledis, you're going to pour it into the cholent that is yatzaledis, and you're going to be over on Bishul 101. A davar lach that's not yatzaledis, water that's not yatzaledis, if you increase it to the temperature of yatzaledis, you're over Bishul. That's what the Mechaber is worried about, says the Mishnah Berurah. There are others that say also that there's another problem, and that is the cholent is in a kli rishon al gabi ha'esh. The cholent is in a pot that's on the fire, that's a kli rishon. The water is in a pot on the fire, it's also a kli rishon. But when you pour the water out of the pot, there are those shittas that say that as soon as the liquid exits the pot, it gets a din of a kli sheni. Now, in mid-air, in midstream, it's a kli sheni. But when it goes back into the cholent pot, it's going back into a kli rishon. To take water out of a kli sheni and put it into a kli rishon is bishul. So there are those that say that that's what the Mechaber is worried about. Says the Mishnah Berurah, but v'ayin b'achrayim shekasru, but take a look at the achrayim that write, d'lefi mashi yavur l'kamam b'simin shin yuches sif tezvav ba'agah. Based on what we're going to see about Hashem Yisparach in the Ramah, in Siman Shin Yud Sif Tezvav, da'ananoi hagim ka'apaiskim, that we paskin like the paiskim who say, Dem loinit stanin legamri, that if the water does not cool down completely, afilu b'davar lach, even though we're dealing with liquid, ein bai b'shum bishul oid. We paskin like the shittas that say that even a davar lach, even a liquid, even if it's not yatzaledis, but it's not stanin legamri, if you increase it to the temperature of yatzaledis, that's not bishul. Imkain, if so, then even if the water is not yatzaledis and you pour it into the cholent and it becomes yatzaledis, or even if the cholent is not yatzaledis, and by virtue of pouring the hot water that is yatzaledis into the cholent, you increase the cholent to yatzaledis, it's not bishul, as long as they warrant nitztanin legamri. And the Mishnah Berurah says people do this all the time. People take beans from a kli rishon and they take it out of the kli rishon on Shabbos and they put it into a plate. So now you have beans that came from a kli rishon. They're in a plate that's a kli sheni. And now from a kli rishon that was on the fire, they take gravy and they pour it over the beans. So what are you doing? You're taking beans, ostensibly in a liquid, that are now in a kli sheni, and you're pouring hot gravy from a kli rishon onto the beans in that kli sheni. V'imkein, and if you're going to have the Mechaber's concern, kevin sha'kitnias b'kli sheni, since the kitnias are in a plate, which is a kli sheni, and you're pouring it out of the gravy from a kli rishon, havalei bishul, it should be bishul. Ela al karchach, you must say, the kevin shaloin nitztan legamri lo shach by bishul. Obviously, we paskin that that's not bishul. Ve'evshir shalazek kivin Ramah, and maybe this is why the Ramah writes at the end of the sif that we just learned, b'masha kosav ayin lekabam simin shin yurches. Maybe this is why the Ramah references us to simin shin yurches. V'hainu te'en lahachmer b'hadavar. Because the Ramah is trying to tell us that we don't have to worry about what the Mechaber just said. If you look at Shid Yud Ches, you'll see we don't paskin this way. When we come Mokim, nevertheless, Mashmi mi Magen Avram b'Maskanosai, it seems from the Maskana, the conclusion of the Magen Avram, Da'av she'ein limches biyad hanoyegim lahakel, even though we don't protest to those that are mekel, Tov yaisel linig shaloi la'aris haroischid min ha'kli harisha l'ka'ara al masha b'soichai ki'im b'kaf. He says it would be better that if you take out food from a kli rishon and you put it on a plate, so now it's in a kli sheni, don't pour from a kli rishon onto the kli sheni, use a ladle. So now the pot is a kli rishon, the ladle is a kli sheni, and you're pouring it over into the from a kli sheni onto the kli sheni. Certainly, if you take the beans and you put them on a plate and you let them sit there for 20 minutes, so now they're in Stan al-Gamri, bevada yesh medina lizar shelo lishpach aleim a kli rishon kim hayedekaf. Now certainly you can't pour from a kli rishon onto this kli sheni, because now you have beans in liquid that are mitztan and legamri, and now you take hot liquid from a kli rishon and pour it onto it, and you raise the temperature of the liquids that are on the plate to yatsa lettuce by. That would be Bishul 101. Okay, thank you so much for joining me for limud HaTorah. This was a limud HaTorah should be making against Klal Yisrael. The Ron Shem should send Yeshua for first pronounced Shidduchim to all the need. We should be zeicher to see the Bias God Tzedek, but Meher v'Yameinu Amen. Be well.